Hi there, I'm Tom Field, Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. I want to welcome you back to our latest Cybersecurity Leadership panel, where we talk about some of the burning issues that organizations are dealing with as they move forward from pandemic to what our new norm will be as we approach 2021. We'll take a moment just to introduce our panelists here. Joining me on the screen today, we've got Chuck Brooks, who's the president of Brooks Consulting. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
We've got Gal Helemski, who is the co-founder and chief innovation and product officer with PlainID. Gal.
Thank you. It's nice to be here today.
David Merkel, CEO with Expel. Dave, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here, Tom.
Joined by Stephen Fridakis. He is the technical program manager, security, mergers and acquisitions with Google. Stephen.
Hi, Tom. Thank you.
Anahi Santiago, CISO, ChristianaCare Health Systems. Anahi.
Happy to be here.
And Stephenie Southard, who is the CISO and vice president with BCU Credit Union in Illinois. Steph, thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure, Tom. Thanks. Excited to be here.
Folks, to get started here, I would like to throw out a question. And Gal, how about if you take this first? And I would welcome everybody's input on this. But my question is, what are we going to look back on post-pandemic? We've gone through our digital transformation. We've deployed, we've secured our remote workforce. We've struggled with identity and access and visibility and all these other things. What are we going to look back on and say, why did we used to do it that way? Gal, I'd welcome your perspective.
Most of us are starting to get used to work from home. It's not just working from home, it's the methods which you need to adopt in order to work efficiently from home. It's not just, like the platform we're using today, Zoom or whatever, but more collaboration, or online collaboration, basically. You can't sit in a room all together and discuss ideas. That's not always possible. And you have to do that while you're remote. And how do you do that in an efficient way? How do you make your business continue to operate just the same and deliver and be aligned with all the timelines which you have set for your business, but with this new situation? So I think we have found in many cases that some of those tasks are even done much efficiently when you're at home.
I welcome other perspectives. Who would like to jump in?
One of the things I think we'll look back at is that most companies were not prepared. They didn't have any risk management policies in place. They haven't looked at contingencies. And now they'll say, oh my gosh, we should have done that beforehand. And because the writing was already on the wall, there's been plenty of breaches that have taken out companies. It's not just COVID-19, and there's a lot of different kinds of threats. So I think more the value now for most companies is that, we have to look at this in a long-term perspective, how it impacts productivity in business and security, and look at things up front rather than react to them. And I think that's the new trend.
And I hope that we learn from this and we can start to cut out waste so that we can be equally effective once we either maintain this world of remote work or when we go back into the office.
And I think for us, and including me, it was a mind over matter thing. I had to see the folks sitting in the chair. If they were sitting in the chair, we were productive, right? That's just the way I was thinking of it. But now in chatting with, our internal managers and word on the street with other security and IT folks, they feel as much the same way that we are as productive, if not more now, being able to work from home in that environment. And, that's the reason now that we're looking at making that a permanent thing for a lot of our technical and IT folks, because people at home are happier, and happier are more productive people. And secondly, why not offering more flexibility in the schedule? With everything that's going on now, we have folks that need to take off a few hours a day, whether it's taking care of children, their parents, or just themselves, and offering that flexibility to work a little bit earlier in the morning or stay a little bit later online during the evening, I think is a win-win situation for not only us, but for our members and clients.
So we built for many years business continuity and disaster recovery around technology. What we've learned is that the human factor has to play a much bigger role into that. We equated disaster recovery and business continuity to building applications over multiple geographies and being able to essentially replicate data across them. And that in a pandemic situation does not play very well when you rely on humans. So we're going to when we come out of this, we're going to have to do some work relative to that. The other thing that we're going to learn, or at least we're learning, is that we need to rely on data much more. The decisions that we make and how we deploy systems and how we deploy processes need to be much more data-driven than they have been. And the last thing I want to mention is that even though we are connected and we realize every day how connected we are, there are certain times that we build systems because of a business process without taking connectivity to be the utmost component. So for instance, we may have built business applications to submit expenses, to do all of that, but we actually didn't realize, we took, I should say, for granted that people that pay the checks or people that open the mail for the invoices or for the payables will be in the office. And now we actually have to build extraordinary processes to send somebody to the office to pick up the mail because we're so still driven by legacy business processes that need to be revised. So hopefully soon enough, we'll have the opportunity to deal with all these issues.
As I was listening to you talk, Stephen, I was thinking interesting sort of tabletops in a post-COVID company in America will probably take into account some slightly more black swan feeling events if a company is serious about wanting to have the agility necessary to deal with something like this in the future. And I think the debate, that'll never happen, will hopefully lose some credibility to anybody that wants to poo-poo those kinds of exercises.
So I want to talk a little bit about innovation. Many enterprises over the past quarter or so have been forced to re-engineer themselves to optimize the work from home phenomena. So there have been issues around increasing the speed of decision-making while improving productivity, using technology and data in new ways, accelerating the scope and scale of innovation. My question for each of you is, in your sector, what are the biggest and maybe permanent innovations to emerge from this crisis? Anahi, I'd love to hear from you first, given your healthcare experience, because I know that digital transformation was accelerated by years in your sector.
And that's exactly it. I keep saying that COVID has forced us to advance healthcare by about a decade. We've been talking about telehealth and remote visits and virtual health for years. I've been in this industry 15 years, and we were talking about it when I first entered the industry. And we've been able to achieve in months what we've been talking about for forever. And we're certainly not going back. And in terms of just the positive value that we've been able to deliver as an industry in the midst of this pandemic by being able to leverage technology for these very same things, for care, has been immense. And I'm not actually just talking about the video visit, but all of the different devices that we can leverage to either send home with a patient so that they can help us to virtually deliver care, or leverage with a clinician, either in the hospital or outside of the hospital. I mean, we've been able to do things even just to be able to limit the amount of contact that we have with COVID positive patients by using technology to be able to communicate with them without actually having to physically be with them. So I definitely think that in healthcare, we've transformed the industry and we will not be going back.
I see the same from the other side of that issue. I mean, from organizations who are looking to expedite their modernizing their overall infrastructure. Now, why is that? Because if up until now many organizations have kept the concept of we are behind our firewalls. If our employees wants to access the data, they have some kind of physical security. Maybe they have the smart card, or they have to pass some kind of gate. Now, when they are working from home, that's not the case. And you have to take into account multiple considerations when you're enabling access remotely. You have to know who the user is, where the user is accessing from. You don't always have that physical element you can rely on. So you have to adopt more dynamic type of methods in order to reduce the overall risk when you're enabling access to data and resources. And from my perspective, what we are seeing is a greater demand or an increasing demand to solutions that can provide such capabilities. We see many organizations are looking to adopt to working from home and adopting the dynamic nature of decision, not just we are okay behind the firewall, but we don't know. More of the zero risk type of solutions. We need to know only when the user is trying to access. That's when we can take the decision, can the user access that resource, see that data, do that operation.
The thing that we see like across our customer base, mid, large enterprise customers, anything that has cloud attached to it as a project has gotten significantly fast-tracked.
I'm actually very skeptical about innovation under these conditions. The ability to interact closely, to debate, as much as we can think that it can be done in this kind of forum, I don't think is as good as the actual contact of people on an ongoing basis. And a lot of it comes by accident. So yes, we had to innovate because we had to find ways to deal with things. So something good came out of this in terms of empowerment, but we're very skeptical about our ability to innovate at the level that we need to innovate unless we come back into it may be hybrid or maybe the way things were, and that has to happen soon.
One of the trends that I've noticed too is that there's much more attention both by the public and private sector in investing in innovation in some of these new technologies, and it's probably accelerated the investment, particularly in technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. And machine learning has also been adapted very much for the healthcare, for looking at potential anecdote solutions, comparing things. So I think we're looking at this acceleration in a digital form because of COVID-19 that we probably didn't expect.
We had to quickly find that we needed to align our technologies with the digital world. And in some of those cases, as Stephen was saying, you have those legacy systems, but also regulations out there, like, for example, wire transfers with the federal. So we did as much as we could to align that, but we have identified a few of those out there that we couldn't do, right, that we are still running that risk with and needed to do the old way until we come up with that innovation to need it.
Folks, I want to transition and talk for a few minutes about risk acceptance. To support this innovation and speed we've talked about, many organizations had to take certain shortcuts to enable connectivity, access, workflow. There was a certain degree of risk acceptance that was allowed by organizations and even their regulators. So Chuck, I'd love to start this question with you and hear from others. What specific short-term risk acceptances are going to have to be addressed now with a permanent solution? And what are some of the technology solutions that might be able to help?
I think now that companies have come to the reality that 43% of us will probably be staying at home, according to Gartner, after COVID-19, working from there. There's a lot of new technologies that will have to adapted. One, of course, is company VPNs have to be very strong, probably customized. There'll have to be new types of encryption, a little bit more sophisticated encryption that's used in most companies, because when you have employees working from a variety of locations, exposed to a lot of different devices, encryption sometimes is your best protection. And I think also this goes back to also looking at some of the big threats, which is really still the phishing and social engineering threat, which is the primary threat on emails. And I think employees will have to go through a training at home and know how to not click on a device that may cross-pollinate their work load too, which is still another way in a major venue now for attackers. So I think a lot of those things will have to be changed and made into sort of a permanent policy framework. And eventually, again, some of the newer technologies like machine learning will also be implemented to help automate the systems in the firewalls and everything else that's necessary from a much more greater threat landscape and an expanded work threat environment. So I think all these things are practical and can be done. It just needs now to be planned and implemented.
Some of the risks that we saw that we had to accept had to do with our extended workforce. So some of that had to do with elevated access rights to enable them to do their jobs. Some of it was actually a little bit surprising. So when you think of things like an outsourced SOC or an outsourced call center, we were taking things for granted that they can meet the SLA for, say, authorization and access and verification of identity as long as they're in their building, because somebody else attested to it. And the moment they go to work at home, all that goes down the drain. And they would come to you and they say, you need to relax the SLAs with me. So that's an issue and a risk that a lot of companies had to accept. Another thing that I see quite a bit these days, because I'm working with a Google Life Science company, is that we have to actually allow some of our staff members to take equipment at home. And I don't talk about laptops. I'm actually talking about servers or other equipment, especially in the medical side, that they have to be able to use and test. And essentially, we see mini labs being created at home, and that has pretty sensitive stuff. And then the other thing that I see quite a bit is again, going back to third parties, the trust of the network. We build systems that had to do with, okay, I trust or I elect not to trust in the zero trust environment, or I elect not to trust your laptop. Well, you know what? We have to go beyond that now and not trust a whole network, a whole subnet that is associated now by means of connectivity to my company's network. And that makes for some really tricky rules. I know of a certain cloud provider that is demanding static IP addresses at a very high cost to those that want to connect. Obviously, we're not doing that, but we had to trust whole networks, especially for people that had to build labs at home.
Again, from my customers' perspective, the risk is higher. You have to enable more access. I mean, otherwise you would stop your business. People are working from home and you have to accept that. It means that you need to enable access which wasn't provided before. Now, the other side of that is, how do you control that access? Not only how do you control that access, afterwards, how do you govern the access? How do you understand what was provided? And how do you not leave too many doors open? So we certainly see more organizations looking for means to control that. They need better visibility to understand where their employees are working from, what can they access, not only what can be done, but also what was done, where they accessed from, was that an approved access or not. So there is a lot around access. My perspective, and that's why I'm in identity and access management area, my perspective is that identity and access management is like the last barrier of security. You passed all the firewall, antivirus, all of the other controls, and eventually you're left with identity and access management. You have your data, you have your resource, and the identity can either access or not. And here now we see a much growing need for better controls over that specific area. And not only to provide the access, but also afterwards to govern and to monitor what was provided.
And I can expand on that. We were, I think, in a pretty unique, I shouldn't say unique, we were in a really good situation in terms of we were a bit ahead of the curve. Our organization is highly innovative. They really believe in digital and had taken the rubric of our caregivers should be able to access our resources and assets from anywhere, wherever, whenever, from whatever device. And so to marry that up with our cloud-first strategy, we had to really think about how we were going to enable that. And so we did the foundational things, such as having, an automated provisioning system, multi-factor authentication, VPNs on our own devices, SSL VPN with a Citrix backend for those that were accessing our resources without a laptop or a workstation, and then took that further by implementing our cloud access security broker. And that piece of it, I think, has been the most important technology in enabling us to be able to move very quickly our folks out to the homes. Because we had already designed a policy set where through our cloud access security broker, you have policies around access. Conditional access if you're on an owned device versus if you're on an an unmanaged device. You can view, you can't download. You can view, you can't send. And so that enabled us to really be very flexible in what was already in place, where I think a lot of other organizations have struggled because they didn't have the infrastructure to be able to enable the kind of access that Gal that you're referencing. So I think that piece of technology has really been very powerful in our big push to get everybody home.
I think something else that we haven't touched on is we took a short-term risk of not having enough man or people to cover with us putting everybody in that work from home environment. If not hundreds, we've got thousands of devices now joining our network and staff trying to conduct secure processes and business as they did normally. And then you throw in the phishing and the social engineering attacks out there. So we've got to make sure that we've got enough people in place to do that. So that's one of those short-term risks that now we're taking the time to look back at and say, do we have the right manpower where we do we need managed services? What else do we need to make sure that risk is low enough now that we've adopted that work from home model?
And one thing to add that I'm seeing a lot from some of the clients I work with is one of the basic things that they're really having to implement is just basic cyber hygiene among their employees. There has been some training, but most small businesses don't have that training, and even medium-sized businesses don't have that training. And I think sort of before technology, just the basics of what not to click on, how to separate your devices, how to coordinate with your administrator. All these types of things are really important. And, if we're going to start at base one, I think we need to start at cyber hygiene.
Expediency compromises privacy. So we gave a lot of privacy away these days. And we can all reflect on that.
It's a perfect storm. We've got economic turmoil, we've got dire health conditions, social upheaval, pandemic fatigue, which is real and every organization's experiencing. It really is a perfect storm to foster insider risk, and whether from malicious behavior, desperation, or just a pure accident, costly incidents could be ahead of us. So my question, and I'd love to start this with you, Stephenie, in financial services. What processes and tools are you now using to monitor and mitigate the heightened insider risk across this hybrid workforce?
And as I was just saying earlier, one of the things we looked at was how do we make sure we reduce that risk? Since we are not 24/7, how can we make sure that we're addressing that? And luckily, we were able to go to a managed service with CrowdStrike for 27 monitoring on all of our endpoints. We felt that risk was high enough that it should be monitored, and they have a much broader skill set level in staff than we did. This also allowed our team to focus on other critical initiatives, such as rerouting all those data paths to our Citrix VDI, making sure that those were encrypted at rest and in transit with the Gemalto Talus software. And then we also had to assess our data on the network. Anything that was classified as a high risk, we had to lock down any functions, such as copying or moving data around. In Azure, we set up GPOs that allowed us to lock down so no one could print or install any software or hardware. And then we also did the external use of drives such as USBs. Those were also locked down, so no one could take any of that data out. We also have in place DLP, of course, tracking any of that data that's going through emails and within our data warehouse and network, and just making sure pretty much we're tracking that data, who it's going to, who should be accessing it, and in what type of access they're using it for has been our focus within the last 3 months.
In terms of insider risk, our biggest our biggest challenge right now has been the new version of shadow IT. And I call it the new version because, you know, in the traditional sense, shadow IT meant somebody was going to Dropbox, to, you know, to Slack, to unsanctioned assets that we could get visibility to with our web proxy gateway or with our cloud access security broker. But what's happening now is that the personal iPad or the personal phone is now sitting next to the work laptop, and the work laptop isn't always necessary. And our caregivers don't necessarily have to log onto our network to get to the assets that they need. And so there's now this new ecosystem of apps and things that they can use to be productive at work that don't leverage our actual assets. And so they're creating workflows and data in environments that are not sanctioned that we have zero visibility to. And they're not doing it for malicious purposes. They've just learned of a new app that their peers are using that they're deriving value from. And so for us, there isn't a tool that enables us to have visibility into that. The actual tool is communication and education and constant dialogue with our leadership and our caregivers and information dissemination so that we can learn about the tools that they might be using that we have no visibility to, so that we can educate them on what tools to use, or so that we can actually have an opportunity to perhaps assess those tools that are deriving value and onboard them into our portfolio. And that to us, I think, has been the biggest challenge, is making sure that we have enough dialogue to learn about those things that we just can't see.
The primary thing we see in our customers for insider risk today, like in this COVID moment, are accidents, as opposed to like an increased risk around maliciousness. The speed and number of transitions and changes. Maybe it's an organization going from traditional to cloud, and that's a new motion for them. So, you know, the ubiquitous open S3 bucket of doom, right, is a significant challenge because all the things that existed before to prevent some of those risks don't get adapted as they adopt a new operational model, and then they have to relearn some of those lessons. And then the way you solve those problems, if you're going, say, from traditional to cloud, the data that you need to look at is different. The shape of the risk itself may be a little bit different because it's not a one-for-one mapping to physical assets, and the organization stumbles on that. So I think the insider risk around just mistakes is the thing that we see on a day-to-day basis. It's pretty tangible.
I don't think there is a word insider that sort of fits a profile anymore, because it is indistinguishable when you work side by side with a joint venture or a partner or a long-term hire, you name it. And the threat itself is very contextual. So I think we'll be way oversimplifying it by just saying, oh, you just need to define access to a file. I mean, it's so much more complex. A library that somebody provides that you bundle into a device that delivers insulin can actually kill someone. And you don't have visibility into what was just provided to you. And you don't have it could be malicious. It can be for purposes of loss of reputation of a company or so on. I believe the whole new model is required. That's going to be very much about knowing the context of what is going on with a particular artifact. And I spent years in my life securing movies. I was in that business for a while, and I was saying we would spend millions making sure that you don't see the episode before it is broadcast. But the moment it's broadcast, within 5 minutes, would love to give it to you for free. So that's the notion of context. And we need a new model. The current model doesn't actually work very well. And all we need to do right now is to introduce an idea of time and the idea of purpose. So in other words, you have the artifact and you need to know what the risk is at any given time, and a dynamic model that changes as time goes by or purpose goes by. It's tricky, and I don't think there is a technology that actually fits very well right now.
And I think zero trust is really what is really the solution or the discussion which talks about how do you minimize both insider risk and external risk. How do you provide the access only that is needed based on context of access, based on the level of risk, based on other factors. So basically what you're saying is that access is not predetermined, but access is calculated when the user is actually trying to access. And if zero trust in the past, you used to consider that only for network type of access, today we see that it is also used for more higher level of access into your application, into your assets, into your data. So basically that would address both the insider risk and the external. There is a significant movement towards a paradigm where you say, we don't know who the user is, and only when the user is trying to access, that's when we are trying to take into factor all of the relevant elements, not just what we currently know about the user, but what we know about the situation the user is trying to access. And I believe that would address both the current situation, which introduces more risk. It would address the insider-related risk and, of course, the external access. And they certainly agree with you. This is an area which needs more innovation. It needs more solutions. There is a concept, which is, I think it's a good concept, but now the technology needs to adopt that and need to provide real solutions that can address that specific challenge.
In terms of insider threat, as we all said, it really is mostly accidental, and it relies on a lot of variables there that are difficult to control. I think the trends now are going to looking at behavioral anomalies, and some of the intelligence work and groups that are working in that area look at that any aberrations, and they're using machine learning for that. And I think also it depends where you're at. If you're in the defense and aerospace sector, insider threat is a different type of threat because you're also dealing with professional espionage in nation states which have much more sophistication targeting you. So I think you have to sort of separate where you are as a company or an industry, and whether it's competitive intelligence, whether it's employee just being disgruntled, stealing information. All these have to be sort of worked out, and you have to build a strategy and put in products and incident management in all those areas.
Let's take a look to the future. There are many now that predict that the work from home era is going to extend well into 2021, maybe beyond. And yet the conventional methods for perimeter monitoring, endpoint detection are likely insufficient to provide a shield over this vastly expanded threat landscape. Dave, I'd love for you to take the lead on this. Which technologies or services do you feel are critical in defending this extended remote access world? And how can we secure appropriate human and financial resources in the economic climate we have now and face in the coming months?
Yeah, just a couple quick thoughts. First, I'm sure Gal will double down on this, but I think investments in around managing identity so that you can implement as much of a zero trust reality for your business as you can will make you naturally more resilient. I think that's I think a lot of companies like Expel were cloud native, were born in the modern era. We realize a flexibility of operations because we are built as a zero trust company. We were cloud native. We moved our whole SOC from sitting in a room dealing with our customer base 24/7 to sitting in their living rooms in the span of 12 hours and experience zero disruption. And so I think adding that kind of agility to your business is important. The other thing that I think is important as you are looking at solutions, dealing with, if you are one of those organizations that is going through rapid cloud adoption, particularly if it's accelerated because of COVID, you're going to need to find the right expertise to deal with that. Dealing with securing a cloud infrastructure or cloud application, what have you, is frankly vastly different than what traditional infrastructure requires, and that's its own skill set. And so whether you're talking about staffing to have the people that you need to solve that problem, or you're looking for a partner to be able to do it, make sure that you have some idea on how you're going to check their cloud credentials. Like, do they actually know what the heck they're talking about? Do they know what a certain attack looks like in AWS versus traditional infrastructure? Do they know all the sources of signal that you should be implementing so that you can sufficiently protect yourself?
You know, some other basics ones, you want to make sure you have VPN, MFA. If you can put a CASB in place, definitely do that. Even simpler, you make sure your password is strong and it's a strict password policy. Look at your vendor management and your contract management, because we do have those key critical relationships with those vendors. We want to make sure that they're also doing what they need to do to be working in the remote world in a secure way. We also talked earlier about encryption. Look to see if you can do some type of BitLocker, some type of masking or encryption on any of your data that is, you know, PII, PHI, or high risk to you. Look at DLP measures in place. And of course, as we've kind of been talking about, look at IAM, identity access management, but also privilege access management solutions to put in place. But with all that said, you're only as strong as your weakest link. Make sure you're taking time to test your users, train your users over and over, and lock them down as much as you can. Put those restrictions in place, you know, like web filtering, spam filtering, all of those things to help ease the risk of getting some type of attack or exposure that you don't want.
Steph, you just touched on it, and I'll double down. Really creating the communication mechanisms to not just fish and educate, but deliver the kind of awareness and education that used to happen by being in a conference room together, or by walking the floors, or by seeing somebody while you're washing your hands in the bathroom. I mean, there's so many opportunities to dialogue when you're all in the same building together, or really collaborating, communicating, and a lot of those things have been lost. And so I'm looking at platforms, opportunities, mechanisms to be able to re-engage in different ways if we're all going to remain remote. Because I think a lot of the education that we deliver informally has been lost, and that is a major risk point to organizations that we need to go back and think through.
Zero trust is a certain great opportunity, but we need to go beyond the device. So I think the future will probably have a zero trust network. Zero trust will totally fail us unless we manage to help the exploitation of the endpoint, because you cannot have it unless you combine the two. The dealing of the exploitation of the endpoint together with the zero trust network will be really fantastic. The other thing is that I hope someday we will take the notion of the containerization and bundle with that better security, because that will allow us to use containers to deploy services that are secure, and they can be totally isolated and function in that way. So that's a great opportunity of what we learn on how to truly do applications that can now be self-reliant and can live in a network that partners and joint ventures and so on can access without us having to even deal with providing access management to them. It will be deployed as such using container technology, but it's not there yet. It will come. So there's a very good opportunity to use the stack and rethink it by adding such features to it. And I hope we'll see it quite soon.
I think this is very true. This is very correct. We see that with many of our customers that they are looking for such solutions. I think another area which would be growing is adaptive access. It ties very well with the zero trust, where you're not only providing the relevant access, but it is an access which is provided based on multiple criteria of the user itself, and that's something which we hear again a lot of demand around that. Again, if we look back at how security was built in the past, everything was in the code, everything we had to develop by ourselves. Then it went out of the code to more externalized type of solutions, and now it needs to be a bit backwards in the overall architecture. You mentioned containers. Again, it needs to be not in the code. It can't be in the code, but it needs to be much, much closer to whatever we are developing. We are seeing much growing demand in those areas, like you said, in containers, but not just containers. Anything which is closer to the data, closer to the assets, closer to whatever you need to access, and it's calculated in real time, it's adaptive, it's dynamic. Those are the technologies which we'll see growing in the near future. That's my perspective to this topic.
I think the only thing we didn't talk about is multi-factor authentication, which should be added to that stack. I think threat detection is relying a lot more now on information sharing among corporations, countries, verticals. I think you're going to see that more cooperation with Department of Homeland Security, CISA, working with industry in that as the threats become more sophisticated. And I think someone brought up earlier the communication aspect of it. I think one of the biggest changes that has happened that I've seen in the last couple of years is that security is no longer just a sort of an add-on. I think that the C-suite has recognized the importance of having cybersecurity at the top, whether the productivity, whether they be taken out of business, and the imminent problems that could come from a breach. So I think the elevation of the security element to the C-suite is a trend we're going to see more and more of, particularly as we go more to automation, managed security, and other services.
Well, very good, friends. Our time has gone fast. I want to wrap up with some closing comments now. Each of you, what you've done over the past several months has been Herculean. We've gone through a crisis that has taken us in paths we never could have imagined. We've been writing history as we go along. I think we'll look back and see these were just seismic times. My question for each of you, and Stephen, I'd love to start this with you. What would you say your single biggest leadership lesson has been from this pandemic experience that you will hand down to your successors?
So it is not about technology, it's not about business logic, and it's not about people. It's all of those combined. And anything that I think as a security person has to take all these three into account. And as such, if I'm to be effective in what I do, I can't wait for the business people or the technology people or the human factor to wait for me. I have to be able to deal with all these three factors and be effective with all these three. So that changes our jobs quite a bit, and we just have to take this in consideration as we adapt accordingly.
If I had to hand down a lesson to the next person to come in, is our roles are to enable the organization and move at the pace that the organization needs us to do so. And we can do so without compromising cybersecurity by making sure that we're articulating effectively that which we are tasked to do, while understanding critically what our business needs to accomplish so that we can help them deliver.
So when I think about the challenge of, hey, you're running a startup, quick, now it's all fully remote. Oh, by the way, global pandemic, collapse of Western capitalism, whatever. That's a lot of cognitive load being put on your organization, on your people, right? Like there's just so much that they have to deal with. What we found, there's a little twist on a military axiom I've used to describe it, where simple is smooth and smooth is fast. So as we think about strategies and tactics to adapt to the challenges we're dealing with, we play that one in our heads, understanding, there's a strategy or a task or an approach you might have had 6 months ago or 12 months ago that, well, you probably want to significantly simplify it right now if you expect your teams to be able to coalesce around it and succeed in this particular moment.
I would suggest you need to look forward. You need to look, even if it's not expected, the situation can come to different circumstances, and you need to be able to adapt quickly and stay in control over your business to make sure it would continue.
Basically, what we're talking about is risk management. Nothing is static, and you have to have a risk management plan in place, and you continually have to adapt that plan. Look where your vulnerabilities are. Look where the incident responses need to be. Look where your personnel is and who needs to do what. Assign roles, delegate, all that stuff is always adaptive. And this lesson of COVID-19 has shown that you don't never know what to expect. And so if you're going to do any kind of framework or plan, you have to look at as many contingencies as possible, and that involves with technology and people and processes.
Yeah, whatever you call it, if it's an incident response plan, a business continuity plan, a disaster recovery plan, remember your plans are not a one size fits all. Think about all your different locations and all your different users, because each of those are going to have their own plan. If you don't get ahead of it, your chance for that rapid recovery is slim. So review it, test it, even pull in a third-party agent to help you do it, update it, and then move on to the next plan. Because as we've learned through this, you never can be fully prepared, so you always should be doing what you can to get a plan in place for anything that could happen.
Well, Steph, very well said. I want to thank you. And of course, I want to thank each of the panelists for this terrific discussion. We covered a lot here today. I'm really grateful for your time, for your insight. Each of you, thank you so much today. It's been a terrific conversation on cybersecurity leadership. Look forward to seeing you at our next conversation. Until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you so much for watching today.